Hi, today we're going to tell a story that turned the life of the main character, James Hartford, upside down. You won't believe what happens next. He was prepared for his exposé to uncover the secrets of a corrupt system, but he wasn't ready for what happened after the article went online. But before you settle in, make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments which city you're watching from and what time it is right now. It's so interesting to see who's joined us. Now sit back and relax. We're starting. James Hartford, a highly respected lawyer in New York, sat in the courtroom, surrounded by the usual quiet hum of legal proceedings. His office was large, his name known in circles of the city's elite. He had won cases that others deemed impossible, and his reputation for being meticulous, patient, and aggressive in defense had become the hallmark of his career. To James, this case was no different. He had everything: facts, evidence, witness testimonies, all lined up perfectly. And it was the most crucial case of his career. Thomas Wells, a prominent real estate magnate, stood accused of defrauding investors in a multi-million-dollar scheme involving illegal property deals. On the surface, it seemed like an open and shut case for James. He had been working on it for months, his team tirelessly reviewing documents and preparing their defense strategy. The fraud was a clear fabrication, a setup by competing business interests who were trying to ruin Wells's career. But James knew his client, Wells, wasn't the kind of man who would resort to such underhanded tactics. Wells was wealthy, powerful, and well-connected, but he wasn't a criminal. James stood in front of the jury, addressing them with calm confidence, his voice steady as he walked them through the evidence. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, "the accusations against Mr. Wells are built on nothing more than unfounded allegations and circumstantial evidence. We will prove, beyond the shadow of a doubt, that Mr. Wells is innocent. We will show you that these accusations are part of a much larger conspiracy aimed at destroying a man's life." The jury listened attentively. The opposing counsel had no real defense, just weak arguments about paperwork and timing that didn't stand up against James's rock-solid evidence. He knew the verdict was going to be in his favor. There was no question in his mind. But then, as the final moments of the trial approached, things began to take a turn that James never expected. Judge Margaret Collins, who had presided over the case with stoic professionalism, rose to announce the verdict. The room fell silent, and James's heart pounded. He was ready for victory. He had earned it. But what came next was a blow he couldn't have prepared for. "We, the court," Judge Collins said, her voice clear and calm, "find the defendant, Thomas Wells, guilty of fraud in the matter concerning the commercial properties." James froze. The room around him seemed to blur, his thoughts racing as the words echoed in his mind. Guilty. How could this be? It didn't make sense. The evidence was undeniable. How could she rule this way? The courtroom was still, save for the muffled whispers of the attorneys and audience members. But James was lost in his own thoughts. Wells didn't seem surprised. He stood there, calm and collected, while the judge went on to explain the sentence: hefty fines, loss of property, and legal restrictions that would cripple his business. James's mind was spinning. He hadn't just lost the case. Something more sinister had just happened. He had worked too hard, prepared too carefully for this to be an accident. No, this was deliberate. As the court adjourned and people began filing out of the room, James couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. How could this happen? He kept asking himself. What did I miss? He stared at Judge Collins as she gathered her notes and prepared to leave. Her composure was unnerving, almost too perfect, too sure. In all the years of his career, James had never seen a judge so unshaken by the magnitude of a case like this. The doubt gnawed at him, and a single question began to form in his mind. Was she compromised? James couldn't get the verdict out of his mind. As much as he tried to focus on his next cases, the images of the courtroom, Judge Collins's unwavering expression, the smug look on Thomas Wells's face, haunted him. The loss was one thing, but what troubled James most was the nagging feeling that something was wrong. He had worked his entire career with a deep belief in the integrity of the justice system. That belief had been shattered in an instant, and he couldn't simply walk away from it. Not this time. As the days passed, James found himself obsessively replaying the trial in his head. He had won battles before where the odds were stacked against him. His adversaries had often played dirty, but the law had always been his greatest ally. This, however, felt different. The pieces didn't fit. The trial had been too smooth, too predictable. The prosecution had barely put up a fight, and yet the judge had ruled so decisively. Something didn't add up. He started digging into Judge Margaret Collins's past decisions. He had always respected her as a judge, knowing her reputation for fairness and wisdom. But now, as he reviewed her previous rulings, he began to notice a pattern. The high-profile cases that involved wealthy defendants, particularly those in the real estate sector, seemed to have a favorable outcome for the accused. Her decisions appeared more than just impartial. They seemed to consistently favor the interests of the powerful. One case stood out in particular. It had been a land dispute between a development company and an environmental group. The company had sought to build on protected land, and the environmental group had filed a lawsuit to prevent it. Judge Collins had ruled in favor of the development company, dismissing the claims of environmental harm despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. The company, as it turned out, had extensive connections to Thomas Wells's real estate empire. The ruling had been controversial, and many in the legal community had questioned Collins's impartiality in that case. James felt a cold shiver run down his spine. Could it be? Could Judge Collins have been influenced by Wells? It was hard to believe. After all, he had always respected her professionalism. But the more he thought about it, the more the pieces began to align. The coincidence of her ruling in Wells's favor in the past, the unexplained certainty in her verdict during the trial, there was something he wasn't seeing, something hidden beneath the surface. James had to know for sure. The only way to uncover the truth was to dig deeper into Collins's past, and to find out exactly who had been behind the scenes pulling the strings. If Wells had managed to manipulate the legal system, then James had to expose it. But how? He began by looking into the network of people around Wells, his business partners, associates, and advisors. James knew that if Wells had orchestrated something this elaborate, he would have had help. The real estate mogul was not the kind of man to get his hands dirty with something like this. He would have used intermediaries. After a few days of quiet investigation, James stumbled upon an interesting lead. A private investigator named Doug Rivers had been hired by Wells's company several times in the past. Rivers was known for his discretion, and his reputation in the legal world was one of getting results. It was said that he had a knack for finding information, influencing decisions, and covering up messes for the wealthy. James had heard whispers about Rivers before, but he hadn't paid much attention. Now, however, Rivers's name came up again and again, and it was impossible to ignore. James decided to visit Doug Rivers. If anyone knew the truth about the case, it was him. He arranged a meeting at a small, nondescript office in a quiet part of the city. When he walked in, Rivers was sitting behind a desk, a man who exuded calm, confidence, and an air of secrecy. He didn't greet James with a handshake, but instead gestured for him to take a seat. "Mr. Hartford," Rivers said in a low voice, his eyes sharp. "I figured you'd come around sooner or later." James wasted no time. "I need to know what you've been doing for Wells. I need to know everything." Rivers leaned back in his chair, studying James. "Wells is a smart man. He knows how to get things done, and he knows who to call when he needs certain services. Let's just say I've helped him out in ways that you probably wouldn't want to know about." James's pulse quickened. "Did you help him with Judge Collins?" he asked bluntly. Rivers chuckled softly. "I'm not going to pretend I know what's going on in that courtroom of yours. But let me tell you something. You're asking the wrong questions. If you're trying to figure out what happened in that trial, you're looking in the wrong place. The judge is just a part of the game, Mr. Hartford. A small piece." James frowned, confused. "What are you talking about?" Rivers leaned forward, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Wells didn't need to bribe anyone. He's not that stupid. The system works for people like him. It's a lot more subtle than you think. All he had to do was make sure the right people were in the right positions at the right time." The words hit James like a punch to the gut. It wasn't about bribes or blatant corruption. It was about something far more insidious. The system itself was rigged. He had been too naive to see it before. "But Collins," James began, his voice filled with doubt. "She seems so impartial." Rivers shook his head. "Impartial? It's all about control, Mr. Hartford. You see, people like Wells don't just buy judges, they buy the system. It's the lawyers, the officials, the people who pull the strings behind the scenes. You're chasing shadows. Collins may have been part of it, but she's just one player in a much larger game." James sat back, trying to process the enormity of what Rivers was saying. The legal system, the one he had dedicated his life to, was not a fair system at all. It was a system that could be manipulated, bent to the will of the highest bidder. He had been so focused on one piece of the puzzle that he had failed to see the whole picture. "I don't believe it," James said quietly, more to himself than to Rivers. Rivers just smiled. "You will. In time." James walked out of Doug Rivers' office, his mind swirling with thoughts, doubts, and a growing sense of dread. The city felt different now. Darker, more foreboding. He had always prided himself on his belief in justice, on the idea that the legal system, for all its flaws, was a system that could be relied upon to deliver fairness. But now, that belief was shattering. As he walked through the busy streets of New York, his footsteps echoing in the concrete jungle, he couldn't stop thinking about what Rivers had said. The system works for people like Wells. It wasn't just the corruption of a few individuals. It was something deeper, more systemic. Wells didn't need to bribe people outright. He had learned how to exploit the system, to work within it, to control it from the inside. For the first time in years, James began to question everything. He had always believed that a good lawyer could fight through any injustice, that hard work and perseverance were enough to win in the end. But now he was beginning to see the cracks in that belief. The rich and powerful didn't just bend the rules, they controlled them. And if you didn't have the right connections, if you didn't play the game the right way, you were doomed to fail. James had just learned that lesson the hard way. That night, back in his apartment, he couldn't sleep. His mind raced with questions. Who else was involved in this? How far did the corruption go? And most importantly, how could he stop it? The next morning, James found himself once again at the courthouse. He had to see Judge Collins. He needed to look her in the eye, to hear from her why she had made the decision she did. But he also knew that confronting her directly might be a mistake. If she was truly part of this system, there was no telling how far she might go to protect herself. Still, he had to try. He spent hours in the courthouse, waiting for the moment when he could speak to Collins. But it wasn't until late in the afternoon, as the courthouse began to empty, that he finally saw her. She was walking out of her chambers, briefcase in hand, her face calm, unreadable. It was as if nothing had happened, as if she had just completed another routine day of work. "Judge Collins," James called out, his voice steady but full of urgency. She stopped, turning to face him. There was no surprise in her eyes, no recognition of the tension that had been building between them. She simply looked at him as though they were two colleagues meeting for the first time that day. "Mr. Hartford," she said with a nod. "What can I do for you?" James took a deep breath, his voice measured. "I need to understand what happened. Why did you rule the way you did? The evidence was clear, the facts were on our side. How could you—" She cut him off with a wave of her hand. "Mr. Hartford, I don't owe you any explanation. The verdict was my decision, and it was based on the law as I see it." James felt his blood pressure rise, but he forced himself to stay calm. "No, Judge, that's not good enough. I've spent my career fighting for what's right, and I can't just walk away from this. There's something wrong here, and I need to know what it is." Collins's eyes narrowed. She glanced around, her expression momentarily betraying a flicker of discomfort. But then she composed herself, her face once again a mask of indifference. "Mr. Hartford, you're looking for something that isn't there," she said coldly. "You've lost the case. Accept it and move on. This isn't about you, and it's certainly not about me. It's just the way the world works." James's heart raced. There it was again. The same words that Rivers had used. The way the world works. It wasn't just a loss. It was a revelation. A harsh truth about the way things were. But James wasn't ready to accept it. Not yet. Not when he knew that there was something much deeper at play. "You don't get it, do you?" James said, his voice rising slightly. "This isn't just about a single case. It's about what's happening to the whole system. People like Wells, people like you, are ruining everything that I've worked for. You've sold out to a system that's rigged, and you're all part of it." Collins's face remained stoic, but James saw something in her eyes. Something flickered there just for a moment. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was fear. But whatever it was enough to make James take a step back. She took a long, slow breath, and then her voice softened, just barely. "You don't know what you're getting into, James. You've seen only a small part of the picture. But you've already made your choice. You'll either learn to accept it, or you'll be consumed by it." Before James could respond, she turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowded hallways of the courthouse. Over the next few days, James couldn't stop thinking about his conversation with Judge Collins. Her words echoed in his mind, especially the last part. You'll either learn to accept it, or you'll be consumed by it. Was she threatening him, or was she simply warning him? Either way, he knew that there was no going back now. He had crossed a line, and there was no way to turn back. But he couldn't stop himself. The more he learned, the more he realized that he couldn't just walk away. There was too much at stake. He had to find out how deep the corruption ran, and more importantly, how to expose it. James reached out to a few of his most trusted colleagues, people who had worked with him on high-profile cases before. One of them, a former prosecutor named Jack Turner, was an old friend and someone James knew he could trust. Turner had left the prosecutor's office years ago, disillusioned by the politics and backroom deals that seemed to drive every decision in the legal system. If anyone could help him understand what was happening, it was Turner. The two of them met in a small bar, away from the public eye. James wasted no time. "Jack, I need your help. I've got something big. I think Wells is pulling the strings behind the scenes, manipulating the system. But I need to know how far this goes. Who else is involved? What can I do to expose this corruption?" Turner looked at James carefully, his brow furrowed. "James, you're treading on dangerous ground. You know that, right? This isn't something you can just take on by yourself." "I don't have a choice," James replied, his voice firm. "I can't let this go." Turner sighed, taking a long swig from his beer. "All right, I'll help you. But we need to be careful. If Wells has managed to get to Judge Collins, then there's a whole network you don't even know about. We'll need to be smart about this." James nodded. "I'm ready." The days following his conversation with Jack Turner were a blur of frantic meetings, late-night research, and restless contemplation. James knew he was walking a dangerous line. If Wells and his associates had truly manipulated the legal system this much, the consequences for anyone trying to expose them could be devastating. But James couldn't stop now. He had already crossed too far into this murky world to turn back. He had to expose the truth, no matter what the cost. He had always prided himself on being a man of principle, but now he was beginning to realize just how much those principles could be bent, how much they could be twisted when the system itself was working against you. And that was what he was facing now. A system that wasn't just broken, but one that had been carefully engineered to protect the interests of the powerful. Jack Turner's help had proven invaluable. The former prosecutor had connections, people he could trust in the law enforcement world, and he knew exactly where to look for the right information. Together, they began piecing together the intricate web of connections surrounding Wells, Judge Collins, and anyone who might be involved in this conspiracy. Their first breakthrough came when they stumbled upon a series of communications between Wells and a man named Gregory Harper, a senior partner at one of the most influential law firms in the city. Harper's name had come up a few times in the investigation, and James knew that if he was involved, it was serious. The law firm was known for handling cases that seemed almost impossible, and they had a reputation for getting things done in ways that didn't always follow the letter of the law. James and Jack spent hours poring over emails, court records, and financial documents, looking for any connection between Wells and Harper's firm. What they found was chilling. A series of emails from several months ago seemed to outline a plan to settle a number of cases by leveraging connections in the judiciary. The language was vague, but there were enough coded references to judges, including Judge Collins, that made it clear this was no ordinary business deal. As James sat in his office, staring at the emails, the weight of what they had uncovered hit him hard. Wells had used his wealth and power not just to secure favorable verdicts, but to manipulate the entire legal process, to make the law work for him, no matter the cost. James could feel the knot in his stomach tighten. This wasn't just a case of one crooked judge. This was something far more extensive, a deep-seated corruption that had infiltrated the highest levels of the legal system. And the worst part? He was now a part of it. He had been complicit in the system for years, unknowingly walking hand in hand with the very people he was now trying to expose. James couldn't shake the feeling that everything he had worked for was meaningless in the face of this system. For years he had trusted the law, believed in its power to right wrongs and deliver justice. But now, in the face of the overwhelming evidence before him, he couldn't help but feel like a fool. Jack's voice broke through his thoughts. "James, we've got more than enough here. It's time to act." James shook his head, still in a daze. "I don't know, Jack. This is bigger than I thought. If we expose this, we could bring down a lot of people who are untouchable." "That's exactly why we need to act now," Jack replied firmly. "We've got the evidence, we've got the leverage. The longer we wait, the more dangerous it becomes. We have to do this before Wells and his team close ranks." James knew Jack was right. They couldn't wait any longer. The system had been rigged for so long that, if they didn't expose it now, there was a real risk it would continue to operate unchecked. But how could he bring it to light? James knew that without concrete, irrefutable evidence, they would be dismissed as conspiracy theorists. His career, everything he had worked for, would be over. The only way to make a real difference was to go to the right people. People with the power to make the changes necessary. He needed to take this information to someone who could get results. It was then that James remembered a name. Someone he had heard of only in whispers. A reporter who had earned a reputation for digging into stories that the rest of the media ignored. Her name was Laura Grant, and she had made a career out of exposing corruption in high places. James had met her once at a legal conference, and while their interaction had been brief, he knew she had the drive and the tenacity to take on a story like this. If there was anyone who could get the truth out to the public, it was Laura. He made the call that evening. James met Laura Grant at a cafe tucked away in a quiet corner of the city. The setting was perfect for a clandestine meeting. Discreet, low-key, a place where no one would pay attention to two strangers talking in hushed tones. Laura had aged well since the last time James saw her. She was still the same sharp, intense woman he remembered, her eyes filled with an unrelenting focus, like she was always on the hunt for her next big story. When she sat down across from him, her gaze never wavered. She knew why he was here. "I assume this isn't a casual meeting, James," Laura said, her voice calm but firm. "What's going on?" James didn't waste any time. He pulled out the files they had gathered, the emails, the documents, the court records, and laid them out in front of her. "I've got something big, Laura. Something that could bring down one of the most powerful men in the city." Laura's eyes flicked over the files, her fingers skimming the papers with practiced ease. After a few moments of silence, she met his gaze. "This is big, James," she said quietly. "I knew something was off, but I didn't expect this. You've got enough here to bring down Wells, Collins, and anyone else involved. But you need to understand one thing. If we go public with this, there's no turning back. Wells won't just sit idly by. He'll fight back, and he's got the resources to do it. You're going to make enemies, and they won't be afraid to make your life hell." James nodded. He had thought about it long and hard. There was no going back now. "I know," he said, his voice steady. "But it's the only way to fix this." Laura leaned back in her chair, studying him carefully. "You're right. It's time to expose the system for what it is. But we need to be smart about this. We'll need a strategy, allies. If we do this wrong, it'll be over before it even starts." They spent the next few hours strategizing, laying the groundwork for what would be a massive investigation. Laura had the connections in the media, and James had the legal expertise. Together, they would go after the people responsible, piece by piece, until the full extent of the corruption was exposed for the world to see. But as they parted ways that evening, James couldn't shake the feeling that he was about to enter a fight he might not survive. His whole world had been turned upside down, and there was no way to know just how far the web of corruption stretched. But there was no turning back now. The fight for justice had begun. The tension in the air that night was palpable, thick with the weight of decisions that could shatter everything. As James sat in the dimly lit cafe across from Laura Grant, his mind raced. He had crossed a line, and now there was no going back. Laura looked over the files James had placed on the table before her, her sharp eyes scanning the documents with expert precision. She had always been one to sniff out the truth, to dig deeper when others were content to accept the surface. But even she seemed taken aback by the evidence James had uncovered. "This is big," she said, her voice low but steady. "Really big, James. If what you're saying is true, Wells is operating on a whole other level. This is far beyond a typical case of corporate corruption." James nodded grimly. He had known that, but hearing it aloud from Laura made the reality even more crushing. They weren't just dealing with a powerful businessman pulling strings behind the scenes. They were dealing with a system that had been meticulously constructed to serve the interests of the wealthy elite, and it was far more complex than he could have imagined. "I don't need to tell you how dangerous this is," Laura continued, her eyes narrowing as she glanced back at the files. "Wells, Collins, the whole network. They'll do whatever it takes to protect themselves. If we expose this, they'll fight back in ways you can't even begin to predict. People like Wells don't just lose. They make sure anyone who threatens them disappears." James swallowed hard, the weight of her words sinking deep. He had been in dangerous situations before, but this was different. This wasn't just about one case. This was about the entire system, the very fabric of the justice he had once believed in. It was clear now that exposing this corruption wasn't just a professional risk. It was a personal one. Wells had the power to destroy lives, and James's life was now squarely in the crosshairs. "I've thought about that," James replied, his voice firm despite the apprehension gnawing at him. "But I can't sit by and do nothing. Not when I know the truth. This isn't just about my career or Wells's. It's about something bigger. Something that affects everyone who believes in justice. Laura leaned in, her expression serious. You're right, but it's not just about exposing them. It's about making sure that when we do, we have the kind of evidence that makes it impossible for them to bury it. And that's where you come in, James. You've got the legal knowledge. You know how to build a case, how to present the facts. But this is going to take more than just legal expertise. We're going to need everything, every angle covered. James nodded, the gravity of the task ahead settling over him. They were no longer just trying to win a case. They were preparing for a full-on battle. And to win, they needed to be strategic. For the next few hours, they pored over the files, strategizing their next steps. Laura had a network of journalists, sources who had helped her uncover stories that no one else had the courage to pursue. She would leverage those connections, bring in people who could back up the information James had uncovered. But they couldn't act rashly. They needed to make sure they had everything in place before going public. We need a secure way to leak the information, Laura said, after a long pause. We can't just drop it in the hands of the media. It has to go to the right people, with the right timing. Otherwise, it could get buried before it even starts. James thought for a moment. I know someone, a former colleague. He used to work in the FBI before retiring. If anyone can help us get this out safely, it's him. Laura looked at him with a raised eyebrow. You think he's trustworthy? He owes me a favor, and he's always been a straight shooter. If he agrees to help, we'll have a safe channel. Laura studied him for a long moment, then nodded. All right, but you better be sure. Once we go down this road, there's no turning back. You'll have Wells and his people coming after you, and we need to be ready for everything. James felt a surge of determination rise within him. He had come too far to back down now. There was no point in looking over his shoulder anymore. The decision had been made. The next morning, James made the call. His old colleague, Michael Thompson, had retired from the FBI years ago, but still kept his ear to the ground in certain circles. He was someone James trusted completely. They had worked together on several high-profile cases back in the day, and James knew that Thompson had a sense for danger. He knew when to move and when to lie low. Michael agreed to meet him at an old diner on the outskirts of the city, a place where no one would recognize them. It was the kind of spot that served no-nonsense coffee and greasy breakfasts, where they could talk without being overheard. When they sat down across from each other, James wasted no time. He laid out the situation, explaining everything he had discovered about Wells, Judge Collins, and the web of corruption they were up against. He didn't hold back. This was bigger than just a legal case. It was a battle for the truth. Michael listened carefully, his expression unreadable. When James finished, Michael leaned back in his chair, taking a long sip of coffee before finally speaking. This is bad, James, really bad. Wells has managed to get to the highest levels of the system. I'm not sure if you realize just how deep this goes, but I can tell you this. There are people who would do anything to keep this quiet. I know, James replied quietly. That's why I need your help. We can't just expose this piece by piece. We need to make sure it goes public, and we need to do it in a way that makes it impossible for them to bury it. Michael nodded. I'll help, but we're going to need more than just evidence. We're going to need protection for both of us. If we're doing this, we do it right, or we don't do it at all. James's pulse quickened. This was it. He was stepping into a war he wasn't sure he could win, but he had no choice. All right, James said, his voice firm. We do it right. As the meeting concluded, James felt the weight of the task ahead press down on him. They had a plan, and they had the right people in place, but the risks were enormous. Wells and his network had resources, connections, and the kind of power that could destroy everything James had worked for. The fight for justice had begun, but it was more than just a fight now. It was a war. The days that followed were a whirlwind of activity and strategy. James was no longer the lawyer he had once been, the man who believed in the sanctity of the courtroom and the rule of law. Now, he was a man on a mission, one who had learned that the law itself could be manipulated, bent to the will of the powerful. His world had shifted, and with it, his understanding of the battle he was engaged in. Working closely with Laura Grant, they pieced together their plan. Laura had already begun to reach out to her network of trusted journalists, ensuring that the moment they were ready, the story would break wide open. She had access to a few high-level media contacts, people who would not only publish the story but who could amplify it, ensuring it reached the masses before anyone could suppress it. Meanwhile, Michael Thompson worked behind the scenes, contacting former colleagues from his FBI days, people who could provide protection and resources to ensure that James and Laura wouldn't be silenced. The reality of the situation was harsh. This wasn't just about winning a case anymore. It wasn't even just about exposing corruption in one high-profile trial. This was about taking down a network of influence that spanned across the legal system, a network that had been carefully constructed over decades. The people involved in this weren't just powerful. They were untouchable, accustomed to getting away with anything, and they would not go down without a fight. James spent long hours in his office, sorting through the evidence one last time, making sure that nothing was overlooked. The emails, the court records, the hidden communications, everything had to be perfect. There couldn't be a single loose end. But even as he meticulously reviewed each detail, he felt the weight of the situation pressing down on him. What if it wasn't enough? What if they couldn't expose Wells and his network? What if the corruption ran so deep that they were simply too small, too powerless to make a real difference? These thoughts lingered in his mind like a dark cloud, but he quickly pushed them aside. He couldn't afford to doubt now. Not when he had come this far. He had made a promise to himself. To the people who had been wronged by Wells and the system, he had to see this through. The night before they were set to release the information, James stood alone in his apartment, looking out over the skyline of New York. The city was alive, buzzing with the energy that only a metropolis like this could have. But for James, the city felt colder, more distant than ever before. It had become a symbol of the corruption he was about to expose. The final step was at hand, and James knew there was no turning back. His phone buzzed, breaking him from his thoughts. It was a message from Laura. "We're ready. Tomorrow at noon. Everything will go live." He stared at the message for a long time, feeling the weight of the decision on his shoulders. Tomorrow, the world would know the truth. The question was, how would they react? Would the system fight back? Would Wells retaliate, using his resources to bury the story, to silence him and anyone who dared to speak the truth? James couldn't predict what would happen, but he knew this much. He had no choice but to move forward. The truth was out there, and it needed to be heard. He closed his eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath. His mind flashed back to the beginning of this journey. He had always believed in justice, in the righteousness of the legal system. But now he understood that justice was not a given. It had to be fought for, and that was exactly what he was about to do. James arrived at Laura's apartment early the next morning. There was a sense of urgency in the air. He could feel it in his bones. They had agreed to meet before the story went live, to make sure everything was set, to go over the final details. Laura greeted him with a firm handshake, her face set with determination. "It's happening," she said simply, her voice calm but resolute. James nodded. "We've done everything we can. Now we just have to wait." They sat down at the table, going over the plan once more. Everything had been set in motion. Laura had contacted her media contacts, and Michael Thompson had arranged for additional protection. The files were in place, ready to be distributed to the right people at the right time. "At noon, we release the full story," Laura said. "Every journalist worth their salt is going to be talking about this. It'll be everywhere. TV, social media, news outlets. This won't be something Wells can just sweep under the rug." James looked out the window, his thoughts swirling. He knew that the moment the story went live, their lives would change forever. It wasn't just about exposing Wells anymore. It was about exposing a system of corruption that stretched far beyond what he had initially imagined. The power of the legal system, the media, and the people who controlled it. These were forces he was up against now. But it didn't matter. He couldn't let Wells and his network continue to operate unchecked. As the clock ticked closer to noon, James and Laura exchanged a glance. It was time. Laura picked up her phone and made the final call. Within minutes, the story was set to go live. The first wave of journalists began receiving the leaked files, and news outlets started preparing their coverage. James could feel his heart pounding as the minutes ticked by. This was it. This was the moment that would either make or break everything. At exactly noon, the first headline appeared on a major news outlet. "Exposed. Massive corruption at the heart of the legal system. How Thomas Wells manipulated the court to win at all costs." The story spread like wildfire, quickly picked up by other outlets. News anchors began discussing the allegations on live TV, their voices filled with shock and disbelief. The entire legal community was rocked by the revelations. People who had once believed in the infallibility of the justice system were now questioning everything. For James, it was surreal. He had been part of the system for so long, but now he was watching it unravel before his eyes. The story was gaining traction, and there was no turning back. As expected, the backlash was swift. Within hours, Wells's legal team began issuing statements, calling the story a baseless attack, a smear campaign. But the truth was out now. The media was too powerful. the evidence too compelling. Even Wells's money couldn't shut down the public outcry. James knew that the real fight had only just begun. Wells wouldn't go down easily. He would fight tooth and nail to protect his empire. But James was ready for whatever came next. He had exposed the truth, and that was all that mattered. The fallout from the story was far-reaching. Investigations were launched, and both Judge Collins and several others connected to Wells's network were placed under intense scrutiny. For James, the battle had only just begun, but for the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of purpose. The fight for justice wasn't over, but at least he had done something that mattered. As he looked out over the city that had once seemed so distant to him, he realized that, for the first time, he wasn't alone. The truth had come to light, and with it, the hope that the system could be fixed. But it would take time, and it would take more than just one man fighting to make a difference.